Okay, so thank you to Mindy for inviting me to give this class as we are a few days away from Purim. I titled this topic, Unmasking the Hidden Story of the Megillah. I thought it was very original, but it looks like that's pretty much everyone's title for pre-Megillah, for pre-Purim's story, or unmasking the hidden story. Either way. So every year we read the Megillah, and we are somewhat familiar with the story, right? We got the villain Haman, we have the hero Mordechai, and I felt like this year, special preparation for this year, I looked at some of the storyline, and some of it just didn't seem to add up in many different levels. Just beginning with the very word for the holiday of Purim. Purim really is lots or lotteries. That doesn't seem to make much sense. Why would you name the holiday Purim? Anyone want to give a guess or a suggestion? Or why do we name the holiday Purim?
Because of the Goral.
The Goral that Haman casted. And that's exactly what seems to be what the Megillah says. In Parak Tes, which is your first source, the ninth chapter, it says, Ki Haman ben Amdasa Agagi tzorer kol Yehudim, right? Haman the son of Amdasa, the Agagi, the foe of the Jews, chashav al Yehudim la'abdam, he wanted to destroy them. V'hi pil pur, and he cast a lot, hu agoral, that is the lottery, lehumam ula'abdam, to crush them and to exterminate them.
It's singular also. Pur is a singular.
Right, he'll pil pur, that's true. It calls out, then just skipping a pasuk, it says, right, Esther, thank God, was able to save us. Al Kain, and therefore, karu layamim ha'ela purim al shem ha'pur. That's why we call the holiday Purim, because of the Pur. I have a very basic question. If there was a holiday, let's just say in theory, that was commemorating the salvation of God from some evil terrorist organization that tried to kill the Jewish people through, biological, anthrax was like a big thing for like 5 years. Some poison. Let's say they used some sort of poison. Let's just make it exciting.
Through tariffs.
Oh, tariffs. There you go. Tried to destroy the Jews through the tariffs. So, why would you name the holiday after the instrument that was to destroy the Jewish people? It makes no sense. Haman tried to destroy the Jewish people or he cast lots to decide when to do it. So we're going to name the holiday the lottery. It makes no sense. Maybe you should name it, the salvation or the war or whatever it is, but the actual instrument that he used makes no sense. Another question I want to address is an interesting choice of the title as well for Megillah. Megillah's Esther. That's an interesting name of a book. It's really not just about Esther. Really, it's about the Jewish people. Maybe it should be Megillah's HaYehudim. Maybe Mordechai, he was a pretty good guy. But Esther seems to overshadow everything else. It's a very interesting thing. And these are like these bigger questions that I had, thinking about the book of Esther and the holiday of Purim. So hopefully we'll address these questions. And I want to just say that I got a lot of this material from Rabbi David Foreman, who has a really wonderful book, The Queen You Thought You Knew. And in this book, he asks a lot of these types of questions. So I think we have to go back to the key moment of transition that happens in the Megillah to understand the story. The key moment, if I were to suggest, and this is what I think others as well say, is really happens somewhat in the middle of the story, in chapter 4, in the fourth parak of the Megillah. When Mordechai finds out that there is this decree that was issued to destroy and to wipe out the Jews, and he puts on, I'm just summarizing some of the story for time's sake, so he puts on the clothes, you can see this in source number 2, puts on the clothes of mourning, walks out into the street, and Esther says, "What are you doing? this is not appropriate to be wearing in the king's court. And he says to her that this is what's going on. Here's the letter. Here's the decree. And then he addresses Esther very strongly. There's a back and forth, but he addresses Esther very, very strongly. After Esther says, I can't go. First he says you should go to the king to petition him, and she says, I can't, through her messengers, because he hasn't summoned me for 30 days. And look at what I think is the turning point in the whole Megillah. The turning point here is in verse number Yud Gimel, verse number 13 in chapter 4. Vayomer Mordechai. Mordechai says, Lahashiv el Esther, to answer to the message to send to Esther. Al tidami v'nafshech lihimaleit beis hamelech mikol haYehudim. Do not imagine that you of all the Jews will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. Now, I always sort of glanced over this pasuk. I never really realized what he was saying. But if you realize what he's saying here, it's a very harsh thing that he's saying. He's not saying, I think you're afraid, you don't want to go to the king, it's a little bit scary, maybe you feel that you don't want to risk your life. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, what's your calculus here? Your calculus is, I want to stay alive. Let the Jewish people die. I will remain in the king's palace. And Mordechai doesn't pull any punches. He says, you think you're going to be any different? They're going to know that you're a Jew. Interesting, because she doesn't necessarily reveal what her nationality is at this stage. But he says, you're going to be no different than the rest of the people. That seems to be what his argument is. And then he says, Ki im hacharesh tacharishi be'ez hazos, if you are silent at this time, salvation will come to the Jews from another place. Ve'at uveis avich tovedu, and you and your father's house will be destroyed. Whoa! Again, don't really read these verses with. I didn't pay attention to them to this year. You and your house of your father will be destroyed. In other words, you're going to be wiped out. The Jewish people will live on, but you will be wiped out. Whoa! Where does he know this from? Why is Mordechai saying this? Mordechai is a nice guy. This is a really strong, biting statement. And then he says, Umi Yodea, very well-known phrase from the Megillah, Im la'es kazos yigat lemalchus. And who knows if this is the very reason why you were put into this position in the power that you have in the royal house, like you're now the queen, right? Maybe, who knows? Maybe this is the moment that you are here for. So just to unpack this a little bit, just again, Rabbi Foreman opened my eyes to some of these questions that I can't unsee now. If I'm trying to motivate you to go petition the king, put your own life at risk, if he hasn't called you in 30 days, which was seen to be like some sort of law or some sort of practice, that the king wasn't going to be so happy with you announcing yourself if he hadn't called you. If you're trying to encourage that person to go, do you think that saying, well, the Jewish people are going to be saved either way, so you don't really have to go? But who knows? Maybe this is why you're here. And by the way, if you don't do it, you're going to be wiped out and your whole family will be destroyed. It's just, first of all, it's a counterintuitive argument, because you'd think, if I'm trying to motivate you to do something, I would say, this is it. If not for you, it's over. No, that's not what Mordechai says. Mordechai says, we're going to be fine without you or with you. It's okay. But then also he says, you're going to be destroyed with your father's house. What does that even mean? How does he know that, and why is he saying it? It's just a simple questions here. Okay, so that was sort of in source. You can see in source number 3 that Rabbi Foreman asks these questions. It seems to, if anything, to give her an escape route, that the Jews will be fine without her. So what's he trying to say? Okay. Now, the other question that I mentioned, why call it Purim? Let's try to address this question. So look at source number 4. He says the Megillah itself tells us why, and I sort of skipped over one of the psukim. But if you read the story, there's really 3 verses, and they don't seem to make any sense. I'm just going to summarize what the reason is we call it Purim. Haman cast lots to try to figure out when to destroy the Jewish people. Thankfully, Esther saved the day, and that's why we call the holiday Purim. That doesn't make sense. It should say, Haman tried to cast lots, that's why we call it Purim. Thankfully, Esther saved the day. Even before the other question of, we don't know why we would name a holiday after the instrument of destruction, that we don't understand, but also the verses seem to be out of order. Rabbi Foreman suggests that we misunderstand the word Purim. There's actually another intertextuality, which is what Rabbi Foreman's approach. He always likes to draw different texts of the Torah, utilizing different passages as a commentary on itself. He said the greatest commentary of the Torah, on the Torah, is the Torah itself. And he often will draw from different places in Tanakh to tease out and to show different interesting parallels that show us the greater depth of what's happening here. And here he does it as well. And this is called intertextuality. It's not something he made up, but he's very skillful at it. And he says, in order to unravel the mystery behind Purim's name, we need to look more carefully at the queen we thought we knew. That's the title of his book. We will find an important clue if we return to Esther's first moment of truth. Her first recorded exchange with Mordechai, when the hesitant queen first agreed to risk her life by invading the king's private chambers. Okay, so then this is the story that we read a few moments ago. We didn't understand. What was Mordechai saying to her? Do you need her? Esther would wonder, do you need me? Not really. We could do without you. What? The Jewish people will be saved without you. If you don't go, you're going to be destroyed. And who knows if this is the moment that you've been waiting for to be in the king's palace to save the Jewish people. So in order to understand what's going on in this dialogue, Rabbi Foreman suggests we have to look at where we've seen these words before. Where have we seen these words before? So first of all, he breaks down the context here into really like 4 or 5 parallels to a different story. First of all, we have the Megillah describes Esther as a na'ara, a young maiden. We never use the word maiden unless we're giving a rabbi giving shir, who's translating the word na'ara. But we don't use that. But a young girl, she's married. She's married to Achashverosh, so young girl, married. There's guidance, that was given, the way he wants to say it. There's guidance being given to the spousal relationship, which we'll see how this has anything to do with anything. But right, he's giving her guidance as to when to go into the king. It says specifically her father's house. She and her father's house will be destroyed. And also it mentions this language of, if you will be silent. The language was of the pasuk. I want to make sure that I read it properly. It was, I think I actually have it later on the source sheet, but it's in the same sukkim. Im hacharesh tacharishi. Ki im hacharesh tacharishi ba'es hazos. I think I read this before. If you will be silent at this time, if you will be silent, surely silent, double language of silence, then the Jewish people will be fine, but you will be destroyed. What is this intertextuality of these 4 factors? We mentioned 4 or 5. Nara, young girl, father's house, relationship with a spouse, and double silence. Married girl, double silence. Where do we see this before? Rabbi Foreman suggests, look at the only place in Tanakh where we see the same phrase appear. Hacharesh tacharishi. Look in source number 6. This phrase, if you take a look at Bamidbar, Perek Lamed Pasuk Tesvav, V'im hacharesh yacharish. If the husband, we'll see the context in a second, if the husband is quiet. What is this talking about? So the context in this, in Bamidbar Perek Lamed, is talking about if a woman who's a nara, young girl, who's married, who's living still somewhat referred to as in her father's home because she's between 12 and 12 and a half, and she makes a vow. The husband is entrusted with the ability, it seems to be somewhat of an archaic, not relevant law, but we'll see how there's relevance here. If the husband hears about this law, this vow, I apologize, im hacharish yacharish. If he is silent, surely silent, double silence, then for a day, the hikim is called nidara, and he basically through his silence affirms the neder, the vow, then the vow stands.
Where does it say that she was 12 and a half?
A na'ara is referring to a young girl.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so that's usually the halachic age, but it doesn't say that
Are you
specifically.
saying she was married to him at that age?
That was in biblical times, seems to be the example. Yes. It wasn't even in biblical times. You could go back 100 years and probably find examples of that. Or maybe other countries that are not as modernized. So what in the world, why is there this, first of all, the only other place, it's a great point Rabbi Foreman makes, the only other place this phrase appears is here and in Megillah. Double silence, there's so many parallels. He points out another thing. The word, you can take a look at source number 9, Rabbi Foreman points out that there are 14 times in which the phrase kayam appears in the Megillah. It's all about kiyum. You could take a look at how he proves this, but it's 14 times that Mordechai says, Esther says, affirm the holiday. It became affirmed, kiyum, mekayim. It's all about being mekayim, being a fulfillment of enacting of the story. In the heading here, pairs of 7 in Esther's 9th. He says this one phrase from the book of Numbers ends up being the crux of the entire Megillah. In 4 words, it pithily summarizes the strategy granted Esther victory in her efforts to save the Jews. And then he points out, to find the 14 allusion, this phrase of being Mekayim, of affirming, appears 14 times in Esther's 9th chapter, the penultimate chapter. So what is going on over here? And by the way, 14 is 7 times 7. How many times does the word hafar, which we'll see in a second, is part of our importance here, to annul? It comes up 7 times. And the 7th time is found in this very pasuk. Of the pasuk that we just that I mentioned to you before, the pasuk in Parshas in Sefer Bamidbar, Perek Lamed, the pasuk is Isha Yikimenu v'Isha Yifirenu. That's the 7th time in that portion of the Torah that the word hafar comes from. So why is that important? Because remember, what are we dealing with here? Purim. Purim we thought meant the lots, the lottery. But there's another translation of the word, of the root, the shoresh of far or hefer. And that is, if you take a look at the Radak in Sefer HaShorashim, source number 8, this is where Rabbi Foreman points out, Pur, pei, vav, resh, has 2 different meanings. One is a lottery, but the other is annulment. Isha, yifirenu, v'isha, yikimenu. I'm using the hey because it's if the husband, her husband, Isha. If it's Isha, it's the wife. But if it's Isha with the mapik hey, then it's the husband. If her husband annuls the vow, or either affirms the vow or annuls the vow, then it will be annulled. However, im hacharish yacharish, if he is silent, then for that day he came as kol nidara. He affirms the nether. So Rabbi Foreman says, we're mistranslating, or like I said, has 2 layers. There's another layer to what the word pur means, and that is hafar, which is the same shoresh as isha, yikimenu v'isha, yifirenu. Again, what is the point here? What was Mordechai trying to say, and how does this have any relevance to these 7 times 7 plus 7, which ends up being in the same pasuk? So he says as follows. Esther attempts, interestingly, 3 times to get the Jewish people, to save the Jewish people. It's not all over, right? Just when you think it's going well, it seems to be out of nowhere, almost like Haman's hung. If we're going a little bit quickly through the Megillah, Haman is hung later in the story. he is, Esther invites Achashverosh and Haman to a party. Then she says, come to another party, the whole thing. Then she says, this evil man is trying to kill me and my nation, really outing herself as a Jew. And then he kills Haman. Okay? Then later, you'd think that there's celebration. Then Esther throws herself on the floor later and prays and says, please, please save the people. What's going on over here? So, without getting into so many, there's a lot of psukim to read. I'll just try to summarize for you what happened. So, in this story, an important theme is also the written word. The written word is very important. That's why it's a Megillah. Esther says, you should write me down for all ages. I'm just going to make a bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol niyeh bevaro.
Amen.
The written word is very important. There was a gezerah, there was a decree written by the king that the Jewish people will be wiped out on such and such a date. Esther successfully gets Haman executed. But the decree stood. Achashverosh never annuls that decree. Haman's dead, but that's the anti-Semitic decree against the Jews is still there. And if you see, Esther goes back again after he kills Haman and says you can take all of Haman's property and everything. This is source number 11. Tosef Esther v'tedaber l'fnei hamelech. Esther goes again to the king. And she throws herself on the floor, v'tipol l'fnei raglav v'teif, and she cries. And she says, please, avert the evil decree. V'tischanen lo la'avir es ras Haman agagi es machshavto asher chashav al Yudim. Remove Haman's decree. It's not just enough to kill him. Remove the decree. And then what is Achashverosh say? This is already the second time she's trying, because originally she said that there's this evil man who's trying to kill me and my people. She didn't just say trying to kill me. She said my people. Oh yeah, let's get rid of that guy. Maybe he was worried that there was some marital affair going on. That's why she invited him to the party, sort of getting Achashverosh suspicious. That's Haman. Why is Haman coming? So we got rid of Haman. But she says, what about the decree? And what does he say? Look at what the king Achashverosh says. In the second attempt, he says, "Vayomer hamelach Achashverosh l'Esther malko l'Mordechai HaYehudi. Hine beis Haman asadi l'Esther. I gave the property of Haman to Esther. V'osotu lo ala eitz. And I hung him on a tree, al asher shalach yado ba'Yehudim, for doing this against the Jews." He's like, what do you want from me? I did it, or I did. He's ignoring her request. You said cancel the decree. I said, the king's like, I did. What do you mean? I gave you his property. I killed the man. What do you want from me? V'atem kisvu al Yehudim katov benichem b'shem hamelech. You know what? Write whatever you want. Write whatever you want about the Jewish people, and I'll sign it. You could write out my name, and I'll sign it. But what's the problem here? We're way before the age of email, of Twitter, or what do they call it, X, or what, all these things. You can't, once there's a decree that was sent out through the messengers of the king, that's out there. There's no way to call that back. So he's not saying, oh yeah, let's call it back. He's saying, you want to write a new letter? Hey, write a letter, you want to go ahead? Whatever you want. That doesn't really help us, because we want to annul the decree. Again, you hear that echoes? Annulling yifirenu, isha, yikimenu v'isha, yifirenu. Remember, Esther's trying to annul the decree. What did the woman do? She made a vow, and the husband could annul it, or he could enact it. So let's see. This is our third attempt of Esther to finally get the Jewish people saved, and here is where Esther finally finds success. And they write the letter b'shem hamelech, and they send it out to all the Jewish people, that the Jewish people are allowed to defend themselves. So she's not trying to annul the decree. She's now trying to affirm the king's original decree that the Jewish people were, allowed to be murdered. But now she's adding on to it, and she's saying part one was the Jewish people are going to be killed. Part two is on that day, right, in the 12th month of the 13th day of the 12th month of Adar, which I believe is Tainus Esther, right? That would be Yud Gimel Adar, which would be tonight. He says they're allowed to go ahead. She even mentions the first decree. Just look at the psukim. that original letter, Asher Nasan HaMelech HaYehudim, Asher B'chol Ir V'ir L'Hakil La'amul La'Hasham L'Hashmiru L'Harigu La'amid, that letter that said that the king permitted the Jews to be, of every city, to be wiped out and destroyed and massacred. She says that day, and she gives the day. She says that day, and that letter, Pas Shagen Aksav Li Nasin Das B'chol Midian Midina Galoi La'achol Amim Lios Haydim Le'yom Hazel L'Nitakim Yovehem. The Jews should be ready on that day to avenge themselves of their enemies. So she's saying, yeah, you remember that decree? The Jews are allowed to defend themselves. But it's still unclear exactly what the position of the king is on this whole thing. In other words, we now have two almost contradictory types of letters. We have one letter saying you can wipe them out. Second letter saying they are free to defend themselves. It's, the Jews should be ready to defend themselves against their enemies. So she's referring to the decree, affirming it, and then saying, but they're able to defend themselves. So what really is the moment? And this also explains to us why we say in the song, La Yehudim, La Yehudim, Ha Isa Ira. It seems to be like, it's a little bit of a strange point over here. Shouldn't we be celebrating when Haman was killed or when Achashverosh says, write whatever you want? No. Why are we celebrating? We're celebrating because Mordechai goes out. Mordechai yatzal l'fnei hamelech b'levush malchus tcheles v'chor v'ateres zav gdola. And Mordechai goes out with his beautiful royal robes, and he goes, and the whole city of Shushan was joyous with cries. Right? V'ha'ir Shushan tzala v'samecha. What's going on over here? Under the surface, Rabbi Foreman points out, is that Mordechai does something courageous. He is trying to show public opinion. He's trying to show what is the king's position on this issue. And if he goes out in public wearing the royal garments, that is showing, it's the second letter, which is really the position of the king. But it was not clear, right, so much by the very text of the letters, which one people were going to follow. So Mordechai going out with this Malchus, which explains a little bit why that whole story of when Haman, couldn't sleep, Achashverosh couldn't sleep, Haman's knocking, and then he's given Mordechai's end up giving all this kavod, and he's given the king's garments. Why did that whole thing happen? Perhaps for this moment, to show that Mordechai has in the favor of the king. And if Mordechai, everyone knew how Yehudi, he was the Jew, if Mordechai goes out with confidence, with wearing the royal clothing, with knowing that the king supports him, then the people see, I guess that's what, I guess the Jewish people are the ones that the king's supporting. But the king himself doesn't actually make it clear. This is the moment, finally, when Esther and Mordechai together succeed at I want to say the annulment. It's not the annulment. It's the enactment of the original decree, but adding on that the Jewish people can defend themselves. And this is what Rabbi Foreman wants to suggest is the hidden message here. You could read the pasuk I mentioned like this: Isha yikimenu v'isha yifirenu. But if you read it without the mapike, it's that the wife tried to annul. She tried to annul, but then she then went ahead and tried to, and successfully affirmed. This is what he writes here. Initially, Esther initially focused all her energies on annulment of the first decree. The more she pressed, the less successful she was. But in the end, she was able to achieve victory only by affirming and annulling, or more precisely, by affirming the second decree as a way of annulling the first one. In the prophetic words of the numbers of the pasuk, Isha yikimenu, she's going to try to she affirmed the Isha Yifirenu, and she, the wife, in this case of Achashverosh, was Yifirenu. That's how he's reading it. She was both affirming and annulling, and a woman who affirms it and a woman will annul it. That's exactly how he wants to read the story. And why does it say Im Tacharish Tacharishun? And what was the whole thing that Mordechai was saying? You never know if maybe this is the moment that you're placed here for this very moment. He's saying that I want you to remember these psukim. I want you to, that's what he says. Beveis avicha. He is almost like referencing these psukim to her to tell her that this is the process. Don't worry. If you annul and affirm together, then you will be successful. And that's in fact how the story plays out. It's the affirming and the enacting, and annulling, thank you, which is the deeper message of the word pur, hafar, to annul and to enact. And that perhaps finds even greater expression. He connects it to Yom Kippur, because we start Yom Kippur, which is Kippurim, which is like Purim, with the annulment of vows as well. So that's another piece to it. And even more than that, to answer the original question. What was our original question? Oh, it's getting late. What was the idea we said before? Why did this double silence? He's tacharish, tacharishon. Hecharish. Sorry, if you're quiet at this time, if you're silent at this time, it is that's the problem when you have a big source sheet. Im hacharish tacharishi be'ez hazos. And we also want to, so if you're quiet at this time, then we also want to know, why is Mordechai giving her an out and saying, the Jewish people will be saved regardless. You're going to be destroyed. Because what does Rashi say in Bamidbar? The same idea that we said by the annulment of the vows. If the husband hears the vow and does nothing, and is silent, double silence, the 7 and the 7, remember the 7 times it came up in the Psukim? 14. If you're silent, then it is as if you're affirming. That's the halacha by a vow. So he's saying to Esther, Mordechai is saying to Esther, sometimes you could say, I'm going to be quiet. Sometimes you could say, I agree or I disagree. But sometimes if you're a passive participant, you are in fact rendering a decision. Just like when the husband hears of the vow and had the opportunity to annul it, if he doesn't annul it, then it's as if he's choosing to stand by it. Rashi says in Bamidbar, this is exactly what Rashi says in source number 7, Lamdenu mikan shahagorim takol lechaviro. If the husband could have annulled the vow, and then she goes ahead, and he finds out about it, and he doesn't, and it goes through that 24-hour period, the way Rashi says it, v'naso avono, he bears the sin, because he, in effect, affirms the vow. And therefore, Namdinu Mikan, we learn from this that Gorim Takal Lechaviru Nichnas Tachtov V'chol Anashim. He takes her place for all the punishments. And what Mordechai was saying to her is, the Jewish people are going to be saved. I know that. But by you being silent, you are in effect affirming what your spouse did. That's exactly the flip case of the vow. The husband hears of the vow the wife made. He's silent. He affirms it. Not only is he just a passive participant, he's affirming it. In other words, you, Esther, he's giving us sort of encouragement, but also pushing her and saying, if you are quiet at this time, you'll be destroyed. In other words, you are part of you're part of the problem. You are agreeing to the annulment. We're going to be saved regardless. But what about you, Esther? What about you? How are you going to be quiet? If you're quiet in some situations, if you are silent, your silence is as if you are affirming. Is it confirming the anti-Semitic decree? And therefore, everything makes sense. Even the ordering of the psukim that we first asked. It said first Haman drew lots. Then it said, and then Esther came. With this, there was this machshava ra, asher chashava yudim al rosho v'talu v'es kol banav al ha'etz. And because of when Esther came before the king and she got Haman destroyed, al kain karuli yamim ha'ila purim al shem ha'pur. Because of what Esther did, she annulled and affirmed. Because of that, that's what we call Hashem Purim. So it's exactly in the right order. So that's one approach. Intertextuality, it's Mordechai sending a message to Esther. You cannot be silent. Sometimes when you're faced with a decision, you could say yes, no, or you could abstain. In some cases, you can never abstain, because by abstaining or making a decision, you're rendering a decision. You are making a decision not to say anything. And therefore, the wording is the only two places in Tanakh, Hacharish, Tacharishi, the one that I keep forgetting for some reason. Sorry, but if you're silent, if this time is and that language is only found in two places in all of Tanakh, and one is in Perek Dalet of Esther, and the other is in Bamidbar, and that's what teaches us that silence in effect is affirming sometimes, just as it is over there, and it's Hacharish in Bamidbar and Hacharish Tacharishi in Esther. That's the double the double silence, because when you're silent, you're actually affirming in some cases. Okay, let's also do for a few more minutes another approach, which I found in the work of Rav Aaron Lichtenstein. Rav Aaron Lichtenstein has a beautiful essay, which was really a shir that he gave on Tainus Esther in 1984. And he addresses the same, transition that happens in the story of the Megillah in Perek Dalet. He says, if you look at why is it called Megillas Esther? Again, we ask this question, maybe Megillas HaYehudim, maybe Mordechai, why Esther? Because the message of the Megillah is supposed to show us that there's an internal story that we need to understand, and we can look at from the vantage point of Esther. And Esther's personal story is very much connected to the message of the Megillah. And that is a story of someone who makes a personal transformation. Esther, in the beginning of the story, we're told, does exactly what Mordechai tells her to do. Whether he's the uncle, the cousin, or husband. It says, Ma'amor Mordechai, Esther, Oseh Kasher Haisa B'Amano Ito. When she was with the time of Mordechai's bidding in his house, she did exactly what he said. Very passive. She does what he says, and very simple. All the women were being prepared for Achashverosh. We're going back to the beginning of the story. And Esther does not ask for any makeup. She doesn't ask for anything else. And also does exactly what this fellow Haggai says to do. She listens exactly to what he says. Very passive, very agreeable, and just going along. We start to see a different Esther emerge in this, as I mentioned, in this very transformative and transition climax in the story of the Megillah in the fourth parak. To the point where Esther becomes almost the entire end of the Megillah is all about Esther. Esther says, declare me for all time. Make a yontif. When Mordechai sort of equivocating, Esther says, write this down, establish it as a day, a holiday. And we call it Megillah Esther. So where does this transformation happen? Rav Lichtenstein says, look at Perek Dalet. Initially, we start to see a little bit of a different side of Esther. Mordechai is wearing the sackcloth and all that stuff, and Esther says, you shouldn't be wearing this. You shouldn't be doing this. She's challenging him. Even though that's not the full, she hasn't yet agreed to go to the king to petition, but when he wears this sackcloth and she criticizes him, that's already, according to Rav Lichtenstein, a start of this self-awareness and leadership that is starting to emerge. But really, the distinguishing moment, or the test, the trial where Esther emerges is this very moment where he says, right, Im le'is kizos yigat l'malchus, or mi odea im keis lezos yigat l'malchus. How do we? Who knows? Maybe this is the moment. And Rav Lichtenstein points this out, that the turning point is exactly how, when we saw it, is how the harsh language that Mordechai challenges her to really awaken her sense, what he calls her moral sense, her awareness. He says to her, I'm just going to read a little bit from this article. It's actually published by his light. He says, her approach was, what am I supposed to do? I'm just a young girl. How can I move mountains? The decree was issued. What am I supposed to do? So Mordechai says to her, he persisted in his appeal. And he says, the entire nation of Israel, young and old, is in danger. Everyone. All around, swords are being sharpened, ammunition is being stockpiled, but Esther remains unmoved. Right? She says, I can't do it. I just can't. I can't approach the king. And the turning point, Mordechai says to her, don't imagine, right? We mentioned this before. Don't think that you're going to be spared. He says, what a biting accusation. This is a reading from Rev Lichtenstein's article. It would seem that he should have told her, you don't want to do anything? Fine, you're a coward. That's maybe what he should have said. But he doesn't say that. He says, you'll be destroyed just as much as us. He pushes his assault all the way, Mordechai, appealing to the deepest recesses of a Jewish soul. He accuses Esther of refusing to go to the king, not because she lacks courage, not out of weakness, but rather as a calculated choice. Let the entire Jewish nation be destroyed. Let them all perish, young and old, men and women. I will remain secure in the royal palace. And behind this apparent timidity lies apathy. Mordechai is telling her, if you really cared, if you really were concerned, not just about yourself, but for the Jewish people, would you be able to say, I wasn't called for the last 30 days. What am I supposed to do? Is this the response of someone who cares? Someone who really cares about Am Yisrael. He says, if you remain silent at this time, salvation will come. But what's going to be with you? What's going to be with you, Esther? Are you someone who cares deeply about Klal Yisrael? And that's when the excuses fall away, and that's when Esther faces the moment of truth, and she prevails. She passes the test. And Rav Lichtenstein at that time in 1984, he was really encouraging his students to look around the Jewish people and say, do you care about your brothers and sisters? Do you see that people are leaving Judaism, not invested? Or he's talking about assimilation. We could talk about this in many different areas. Do we care about the hostages? Do we care about the Jewish people being under attack? What our solution is, the Jewish people will survive. That's a promise. But what about us? Are we connected to our people? Do we really care? How could I stop stem the tide of assimilation? What am I supposed to do? Is that the way that we talk about this? Really, an extremely important and like Rabbi Lichtenstein said, Mordechai said to Esther, are those the words of someone who cares deeply? And when she hears this, something in her changes, and that's the moment that Esther transforms. And that's why we call it Megillah Esther, because it's really also the story of Esther's transformation. And she steps up, and she becomes someone who, she demands and she pushes, and she, like we mentioned, a bunch of ways. Either she tried to annul, then affirmed, but whatever she did, she becomes a leader. She becomes the very face of the Megillah, of the whole story. And I'll just finish with one proof to this legacy that Esther left us. One of the most difficult psukim, if you read it literally, in Tanakh is the following pasuk in Tehillim. We may know it very well because it comes up in our benching. There's also a song by, I think, maybe Toronto Pirche or something. Nar ha'isi gam zakanti. I have been young and I am now old. V'lo ra'isi tzadik ne'azav v'zaro mevakesh lachem. I have never seen a righteous man abandoned and his children seeking bread. Really? Really? You've never seen anyone who is good, who's righteous, have anything bad happen to them? How could that be? What does that even mean? So I saw a beautiful explanation. It's in a number of places. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs has it in the To Heal a Fractured World, Ethics of Responsibility. He also has it in his translation on the Siddur. And he says he heard from Mo Feuerstein, who he thinks that it was from Rabbi Soloveitchik, but I did a little research, and Rabbi Yaakov Jaffe has an article on the Sfarim blog where he wants to say it was really from Rabbi Isaiah Walgemuth of Boston, who heard it perhaps from Dr. Abraham Berliner, or heard it from his students, that the following is the meaning of the phrase, Nar isi gam zakanti v'lo ra'isi, I was old and I was young and I was old and I never saw. What does it mean, lo ra'isi? It should be understood. The verb re'isi or re'iti in this verse, said Feuerstein, is to be understood in the same sense. I'm reading from source number 18. In the same sense as in the book of Esther. How can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? The pasuk in Esther, this is a completely new Esther. The Esther who said, I'm just going to go whatever Mordechai says. I'm just going to, what can I do? The king didn't summon me. What am I supposed to do? I don't know. No, now she says, this is her appeal to Achashverosh, when she's saying, you got to save my people. Ki echacha uchal, how can I stand to bear? V'ra'isi, to see, the same language, ra'isi, ra'iti, b'ra'ah asher yimtzo asami, the evil that's going to befall my people. Ve'echa uchal v'ra'isi, again, the same language. How can I stand to bear and see and stand watching idly by? But of done, moladati, to see the destruction of my kin. What is she saying? She's responding to what Mordechai said. Exactly the same thing. And she heard it and she took it to heart. He said to her, the Jewish people are going to be saved no matter what. But you are saying things that show that you aren't part of our people, that you don't care, that you're just, what can I do? This king didn't summon me. And that's why Mordechai said, do you care? And she said, I do care. And he awakened her moral sense. And that's what we mean in the pasuk. When we say in benching, I never saw a righteous person looking for, lost, totally abandoned, and his children looking for bread. It doesn't mean I never saw it. It means I never stood idly by and stood still and watched while the righteous were forsaken, because I actively tried to help them, and I actively made sure to assist in any way that I could.
Wow.
And that's
Beautiful.
Esther's legacy.
Yeah.
Esther's legacy, at the end of the story, she transforms from being this passive mystery woman who does whatever she's told, very simple, very out of the limelight. And Mordechai says, do you care about our people? We're going to be okay without you. But either, like we said from Rabbi Foreman, just going over a little bit, that you're going to be destroyed because you're affirming the decree, because that's what the story of the Bamidbar Perek Lamed tells us. Or like Rabbi Lichtenstein is saying here, where's your moral sense of achrayus, of responsibility for your people? Don't you care about them? And he calls on us to care. And we say it every time we bench, maybe at the end of benching, to remind us that we have food. We just had something that God gave us. But have we ever seen someone who's struggling and stood idly by? Hopefully not, because that's the message that at the end of the day that Esther teaches us. And the Esther's message is Eichacha uchal v'ra'isi. Eichacha uchal v'ra'isi. Double, twice. How could I stand by and just watch something happen? Whatever, we don't necessarily have the answers to life's problems. How are we going to stop assimilation? How are we going to defend the Jewish people from anti-Semitism? How are we going to, I don't know. But we can't stand idly by. We have to, just like Esther taught us, we have to stand up and we say, Eichacha uchal v'ra'isi. How could I stand by? Whatever I have to do, if I'm going to daven a little bit more, I'm going to give to Eretz Yisrael, I'm going to think of my fellow Jew, I'm going to help the Jews in need, whatever it is. But I can't stand idly by. And that's the title track of the Megillah is Esther, because she becomes the face of the story on a personal level, but also on a national level, like we said before, that the whole story is really about this transformation that happens in Perek Dalet, that happens to Esther on an individual level, but teaches us a grander, bigger message to take from the Megillah. And that's, I think, maybe something we remind ourselves at the end of our benching of Birkat HaMazon. We say, Nar isi gam zakanti v'lo ra'isi tzarik nazav v'zar mevakesh lachem. So hopefully you'll remember these words, that how could I stand by and see people that are hungry? I can't. I have to help them. I have to be that person. Be like Esther, to stand up and to face the moment and to say, I don't know what I can do. Maybe the king's not going to react the way I want him to react, but I can't stand idly by. I have to act. Okay, may we merit to be inspired by Esther's story in the Megillah. Hopefully this year it will mean more in different ways. I think for me it will mean a different thing. And it will help us to rise to the moment and to look at the Megillah in a different way, and to remember that the holiday of Purim is a happy day, it's a celebratory day, but it's also a call to action for our fellow Jews. Berei Lechem Purim, everyone.